Welcome to this week's rant, which is entitled, Where is the Rack Mount? All will become clear. Firstly, a confession. I've got two confessions to make today. The first one is, this is not Sunday. The reason why you know it's not Sunday is because I've had my barnet cut. I wasn't intended to have my barnet cut, I have to be honest. But I wandered around the corner to get some supplies from the local shops, and the local barbers was open and there was only one person in there, so I shot in and had my hair cut. So first confession, this is Monday, not Sunday. This is the next stage of the UK's coming out of COVID-19 restrictions, where effectively non-essential retail could open. That was confession number one. Confession number two is I don't know quite when this happened, but YouTube have again been fiddling with the whole comment section on the platform. And as you guys know, what I do with comments is I have all the comments go to a holding area. That allows me to weed out anybody who decides they want to have a swearing fit down the channel, and also those people who love to or want to advertise adult sites on my channel. So I tend to take it to a holding area, that way I can catch that stuff and delete it before it hits the channel. Now the way that's set up is that all your comments go to this holding area. I then log on to the holding area and I can see all your comments and I respond to them. However, for some reason, I don't know why, YouTube has changed the filtering on that so that comments from people who are not subscribers to the channel are not showing up in the unfiltered list. Don't ask why, I don't know why, but there's, the whole idea of the unfiltered list is that you can see everything, but you can't. And in order to see your comments, I've had to go in and I've had to change the filter to say not a member of the channel, as in you haven't subscribed, and then I can see your comments. So I apologise if you've left a comment on the channel in the last 6 weeks. Then I do apologise. The reason why I haven't responded to you is because I didn't know you'd left a comment. And the only reason I picked this up was because I was looking at the mobile app, which I don't really use the YouTube mobile platform, or the mobile management platform, if you like. I tend to do it all on the computer. And I noticed that there were more comments on the mobile app when I looked at it a couple of days ago than there were showing on the computer screen. So I went looking for your comments and I found them. So I apologise for that. Nothing I could do about it because I didn't know about it. So I'm now starting to respond to your comments. So I apologise for that. So that's the second confession. Anyway, back to this video. What do I mean when I say there is no rack mount? So for those of us who are old enough to remember, typically when a keyboard came out, you had the option to buy the keyboard, like this thing, or you had the option to buy the 19-inch rack of the keyboard. So typically a manufacturer would bring to market a couple of keyboard options, whether they be 49, 61, 76, 88, unweighted, semi-weighted, fully weighted versions of the keyboard. And then you would get a 19-inch rack which had no keyboard attached to it. You drove the whole thing through MIDI. And there was sometimes, the 19-inch rack, there were, I can think of a couple of examples where the keyboard was more functional but generally the rack was exactly the same functionality, or the rack was more functional than the keyboard, for one reason or another. But that's kind of what you got back then. You got a keyboard or a rack. Okay, this is the bit where I get to do channel self-promotion. So if you want to whiz through this bit, feel free. But we must observe the parish notices. And the parish notices are, if you haven't subscribed, why not? Hit the subscribe icon. Save yourself some time, hit the bell icon as well. If you want to be notified when videos hit the channel about all the stuff you sort of kind of see around me at the moment, vintage, current, instruments, legacy keyboards, etc. They're the things you need to be pressing. If you like the contents of this video, you know what, it's the thumbs up. Really appreciate that. Leave comments down below. I read your comments, guys. I read all of them. I've just done the piece about apologising for not seeing comments on, but I do read them, I do respond to them, and sometimes they are also the sort of basis for future videos. So please leave your comments. There have been some really interesting conversations or conversation threads going on the channel recently. Finally, for less than the price of a cup of coffee, down there is the address of the TMTG community. Sponsor the channel, keep it rock and rolling. Thank you very much. Your support is very much appreciated. And finally, down there, Instagram, Facebook. Pop over there. Normal shenanigans during the week that are not covered in videos. That's where they will be. But now back to this video. So the question was, back in the day, was the rack worth it? And I have to be honest with that, I think the rack mount versions were really worth it. I really do. And I can attest to that because I do have rack mount versions of the M1, the S50, the DX7, the D20, the D50 and the U20 as well. I probably have some more, but I can't think of them off the top of my head. So I have rack mount versions of all those keyboards. I have the keyboards as well, but I have the rack mount versions. And we'll come on to why in a little while. But I'm just going to move my notes around because I sort of put my down here, the DX7. I'm going to move that up because the DX7 is a really weird example of this, because the DX7 had multiple rack mount options. So if I was to look at the DX7, the rack mount options, the closest one to the DX7 was the TX802. That was more or less a DX7 in a rack mount. But the Yamaha also produced several other rack mount options based on the sort of the FM operators, being the TX81Z, the TX7 and the FB01. And the TX7 and the FB01 possibly you would say weren't really rack mounts, but they were different options to the DX7 and obviously had slightly different functionality associated with them. But they were, I suppose, stripped down versions of the DX7 for a more budget conscious musician, somebody who needed to count the pennies. And I can really attest to that because I remember back in the day buying a new keyboard was a massive investment for somebody who wasn't earning a lot of money. And then of course with the DX7 you had the mother of rack mounts, which was the TX816. And for those that don't know what the TX816 was, it was effectively a 8 DX7s in a box. And you bought the TX816, which effectively was the chassis, and then you could put up to 8 TX 812s, was it, or is it 216s? I can't remember which way around it was. But effectively you bought a card that went into each one of those slots on the front of the 816, and each one of those cards was effectively a fully fledged DX7 that you could control via MIDI. And if you look to the back of this thing, once you put all the cards in it, you effectively had 8 MIDI in and outs off the back of this thing. And you tended, I mean, I've seen one of these working. I've only ever seen one of these things fully loaded and working, where the guy had all the MIDI cables daisy chained around the back of it, but hey ho. But that was the DX7. Yamaha continued the trend with the SY series, and you had a rack mount of the 33, the 77 and the 85. Curiously though, there was no rack mount of the 99, and I think that was because the TG77 was more functional, not by a lot, but it had a few more bits and bobs on it than the 77 did. And the 99 really was just an extension of the 77 with a bigger keyboard and a few more functions, so possibly that's the reason why that didn't happen. Roland made a big thing in the sort of 80s around the MKS series, and the MKS series was really sort of focused at the studio operation rather than the sort of the giggy musician. And the MKS had a whole variety of MKS units, MKS 7, 10, 20, 30, 50, 80, 100, And all these MKS units were effectively related to a keyboard. So the MKS20, for argument's sake, was the RD100 keyboard. Effectively, all the sound and logic boards out of the RD100 were in the MKS20. No keyboard, so you didn't get the hammer action. You could play it with any keyboard, but effectively the tones were all there, and the RD100s, 1000s chorus and tremolo settings, which were rather superb. Roland again with the D series. The D110 was effectively the rack mount unit of the D10. It wasn't a rack mount unit of the D20 because the D20 obviously had a sequencer, and the D110 doesn't have the sequencer, but it has the whole patching tone capabilities of the D20 and the D10, which obviously shared their lineage. Moving on to the flagship synth of that era, which was the D50, had the D550. Again, not a lot of difference between the two, but the D550 was used on so many records around that time. M1, M1R, synonymous. No difference in functionality between either of those two. You got, apart from the fact you didn't have a keyboard on the M1R. So the list could go on, and I've really kind of concentrated on what I've got in terms of stuff that's in my racks, because if I started going looking for other stuff, I probably would have a list along as your arm, and this would just make a very boring video. But what I'm trying to get across is that that's kind of where the manufacturers were in the 80s and early 90s. They were making rack mounts of the keyboards. But what did the rack really give us? What was my take on the rack? Why would you want to go and buy a rack? Well, you got all the functions of the synth. That was the first thing, minus the keyboard, everything the synth could do, you got those functions in the rack. The lack of keyboard meant it was easier to accommodate the synth in my keyboard rig. So I only had one rack back in the day when I was actually moving stuff around, but it is so much easier to have 2 or 3 really powerful synths in rack mount format in a 19-inch travel rack, and you've got so much power from a master keyboard while you're on stage, especially if you've got something like this where you could do splits and you can control each one of those keyboards, each one of those synthesizers on a dedicated channel. You've got so many options for doing that. So that was the other thing. And if you had a synthesizer, if you had something like this sitting on stage, okay, you were always frightened that somebody was going to come across. Now I have a policy, I don't normally keep drinks around a keyboard. I've seen people do this where they have drinks on a keyboard. That's not me. I tend to make sure my drinks are away from the keyboard, because I have had pints of Coke go through the key bed before now. And believe me, Coke or beer on a key bed is an utter nightmare. You have to literally strip the keyboard down as quickly as possible to stop it doing any damage. So you get that, the chance of people spilling drinks in it. You get the chance of people coming around the corner of the keyboard and catching it, and the keyboard goes like that off the stand. I've had that, where you ended up the whole of the corner of the keyboard being damaged. Or even worse, actually doing some damage to the keyboard where it won't play that evening. I've definitely had that. The 19-inch rack better protects the keyboard while it's in storage, while it's being transported. It better protects the keyboard while it's on wherever you've got it, because the enclosure is far more difficult to destabilize than a keyboard that's sitting on a stand with a sort of overhang. You tend to be able to do cable management better with it, because you can have all the cables running down the leg of the stand, rather than what you tend to have with this sort of thing is you have, you can't see it here, but you've got audio cables this end, power cables this end, MIDI in the middle, which all makes very good, it's all good sort of segregation of different types of signal, if you like, because in terms of the E field and the B field, so I'm talking about is when you have electricity running down a cable, you create a magnetic field, and if you have 2 cables next to each other, they can resonate, which is why you tend to use balanced audio cables if you can get away with it, because it cancels out this sort of interference issue as you go down the cable on a long run back to the mixing desk. So there are a whole bunch of reasons why a 19-inch rack mount unit made sense when you were traveling. So that was kind of me, where, you know, the reason why I started buying 19-inch racks is because I actually had a relatively small studio area, and I couldn't get the keyboards in there. So I started buying 19-inch racks because you got all the functionality of the keyboard, but in a 19-inch rack, and then you could just use a master keyboard. And as I said before, this D70 in front of me was my master keyboard for quite a while. I used to use this to drive those racks, and it worked beautifully. It really did work beautifully. So that was why. The other thing, and I don't know, I don't think I ever bought a rack from that era new. In fact, I'm sure I never did. So I can't really comment on this, and I haven't done very much research, but the rack is cheaper to manufacture than the keyboard. For the simple reason, you don't have a keyboard. So you don't have to go to the expense of all the circuitry that sits under the keyboard mechanism itself, the frame, and having a case that can encompass the keyboard. Effectively, you're talking about a 19-inch rack box, 1 or 2U high, typically. So theoretically, it's cheaper to manufacture a rack than it is a keyboard, and therefore it should be cheaper to you or me as the consumer. Now, the reason I say I don't know whether I had one new, I can't remember whether I had one new, and if I did have one new, whether it was actually that much cheaper than the keyboard. But in theory, it should have been. So why has the rack largely disappeared? And I've used the word largely because in recent years we've kind of had smaller versions of the original released in terms of things like the refaces and the boutiques, but they're not really rack mount units. They're really reimagined versions of the original, just shrunk down into a smaller form factor. And there's a few people out there with the boutiques that are selling 19-inch rack conversions, so you can actually mount your boutique in, I think it's a 2U high aluminium body that will effectively bolt to the either end of the boutique, and then allow you to mount it in a rack. Or what seems to be actually more popular than that is sort of these what I call them desktop mounting adapters, where you can have 1, 2, 3 boutiques sort of mounted in a parabolic curve, if you like, on your desktop while you're working away from it. And that actually works quite well, although I haven't got one. I know a couple of people who have, and they've got their sort of 808 and the 909 and a synthesizer sort of all in that sort of parabolic, and it works quite well from a desktop angle, and all the cables can be nicely routed down the back and out of the way. So we've got that, and then you go on to someone like Sequential, for argument's sake, and you know, they have issued the Prophet 5 and the Prophet 10 not as rack mounts but as desktops. Okay, slightly different spin on this. Smaller form factor, obviously, because you're only talking about the control section. So if you think about this D70, if I was to only include the control section, it would almost be where my notes are on either side of the buttons. So you get an idea of how much smaller that would be. And also you don't have to have the keyboard, so you know, you only need something that's effectively 2U high. Or you would effectively put the display and some of the buttons above it and make it slightly higher. But they've issued those as desktops, not racks. Smaller, more portable. So if you are gigging with these things, more portable. It does create a problem in terms of how do you actually mount these, because obviously keyboard stands are designed to mount keyboards, not designed to mount these desktops, but you can adapt stuff. So, you know, there's ways around it. But there is a good case for buying the desktop over the keyboard version. So, for example, for the Prophet 5, doing a quick fishing about on the internet a couple of nights ago, you know, the Prophet 5 plus or minus £100 is around about £3,000. The desktop version, plus or minus £100, depending on where you go, is around £2,200. So let's say that's an £800 saving for not having a keyboard. Actually, that's actually doable. You know, you'd think to yourself, that actually is a good argument not to have the keyboard if you've got other keyboards. Profit 10, even bigger difference from the keyboard. Again, plus or minus £100, £4,000 for a Profit 10. And the desktop version around about £2,900 plus or minus £100. So again, there is an average saving there of £1,100 for not having a keyboard. But if you go and look at some of the other flagship synths from some of the other manufacturers at the moment, the Kronos, the Nautilus, the Phantom, the Jupiter, the Montage, the Modi X, in most cases you can buy a 61 note non-weighted, a 76 note semi-weighted, and an 88 key fully weighted version. Now, some of these are obviously semi-weighted in the 88 and semi-weighted in the 61, so you know, please excuse that, but you get the gist. But there's multiple key bed formats, but there's none with a rack. And I guess in the good old days, these racks would have been 2U high. And if you look at the sort of control surface of a Phantom or a Montage or a Kronos or a Nautilus, you know, there's a lot of controls actually on the surface of the keyboard for the musician to be able to, you know, play or move while he's playing. And you can't get that necessarily in 2U of a 19-inch rack. There's not enough space for that. Really is. You'd end up cluttering it up too much, and you do need space. I mean, especially with people like fat fingers, you know, you want nice big sliders. And this is a 1990 version of that, but the new ones obviously have a decent amount of space so that you can not hit the wrong key when you're going for the sliders. But you've got to have to ask yourself, not only from the front panel, but actually with these new boards, is 2U really enough space? So we've already said on the front, probably not. Inside as well. So if you got to open up one of the old rack mounts, and possibly with the exception of certain ones, and the MKS-20 is one I can think about, which is actually quite loaded with circuitry inside it. But if you open some of the other ones, you actually see a lot of air. You see a circuit board bolted to the bottom, you see a power board, and then maybe there's some other boards in there. And then obviously you've got 2U, which has got a display board bolted to it. But the rest of that case is pretty much air. You know, there's nothing else in there. Again, if you look at the MKS-20, if you open the MKS-20, you go in from one side, you get the piano boards, and if you go in from the other side, you get the effects boards. And it's actually quite dense inside an MKS-20. But yeah, I have to ask the question, is the reason why we're not getting rack mounts? Because if you open up one of these new instruments, it's not just the soundboard. You've got the computer board, you've got the power supply, you've got the Yamaha board, the Korg board, the Roland board, whatever it is, the bit that does the sound manipulation. Then you've got input and output boards, and then you may have boards for other things, and then you've got display boards, and then you've got user interface boards. You've got all this stuff inside this new new keyboard that doesn't necessarily lend itself to being unbolted and bolted into a rack mount. I think the older boards you could quite easily unbolt and bolt into a rack mount relatively easy with very few modifications. But with this new breed of keyboard, I'm not sure you would actually be able to fit all that into a 2U case. But then you say, well, actually, why don't we go for a 4U case? I mean, that's effectively what the ARP Odyssey is a 4U. You know, it's a big tool thing. So you could get all your user controls down the front there, and then you could stack the boards behind it. But of course, it would be, if you went for a full depth 19-inch, it would be quite a deep case and quite a voluminous case. But again, There's no reason to say you actually have to go for a deep case. You can actually go for quite a shallow case, but just being quite tall. So they could build a rack mount version. I suppose that's what I'm trying to say. They need to move the controls around. They need to sort of work out how the workflow works. But they could do it. But is it that I'm missing the point here? Is the fact that the controls are above the keyboard and the user can interact with the controls real time, is that what it's all about? Is that the bit that's stopping the manufacturers coming back and saying, okay, you know, we're not going to do a rack mount unit, and £800 of that keyboard that you're paying is actually the cost of the keyboard and the case, the extra case to enclose the keyboard? Or, cynically, is it just a way that the manufacturers can't justify supporting another form factor on the keyboard, or is it just purely a cost thing? And on that note, I'm going to say, live long and prosper. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.